Good morning, Oldsmobile fans. Checking in with you on some of the progress with our DX diesel 350 to gas high performance engine conversion. As you can see, we're looking at the bottom end of the DX diesel, and what I want to talk to you today about is oil control mods for the bottom end. And I want to show you 3 of those specifically, and I want to talk to you about the obstacle you're going to run into with the timing chain if you use one of these blocks. I don't know if the D block has the same exact sorts of issues as the DX, right? So I'm only talking about the DX here. Okay, first of all, I want to point out that the authority currently that is the only racing engine builder with a book out, a paper book on Oldsmobile modifications, Bill Travato. His position on oil control mods is if you're running on the street, I think he says, you don't want to put the kinds of things in the block that I'm going to put. I'll say this for Bill, he certainly doesn't shy away from controversial takes. Elsewhere in his book, he says that he doesn't believe in dual plane intake manifolds for the street, which really bucks conventional wisdom. He likes single plane manifolds. So, you know, I found several things in his book to disagree with. I really like oil control mods. He says that anything you bolt close to the crankshaft, in his experience, just seems to take power away, with one exception, which is the exception I'm going to make. So we'll see that in a second. Okay, I'm going to show you a bunch of parts, fellas, and they're just going to lay right in because I've already spent several hours working on them, so it's going to look easier than it is. Don't let me fool you. Okay, the first is a crank scraper, which Bill says not to use. Okay, there is one available on the market that I'm aware of. Here it is. This, I believe, I bought from Rocket Racing. And this is a high quality part. They list it for a $455, and so it's designed for a bit longer of a stroke. I have not touched this one yet, other than to give one of the holes a little bit of an elongation. And this lays in where I've got the crankshaft right now on the oil pan studs, and you can see how that's going to work. There are points where this comes very close to the swinging rods and bolts and the counterweights, right? And that's designed to do that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to say this in passing. If you are buying oil pans from aftermarket vendors, you'll see that some, for whatever brand, you'll see that some of them put what they call a crank scraper in the oil pan. It doesn't lay on the rails. It's tack welded into the pan itself. And all it is a piece of sheet metal that is just straight across, right, with no kind of cutouts the way this one has. And so that comes, I don't know, within half an inch, I suppose, of the crankshaft in an even plane all the way. I really kind of question the effectiveness of that kind of so-called crank scraper. I think that's just for bragging rights. What I'm going to end up doing here is spending a couple of hours cutting. This is going to crash. If I try to spin this crank right now, this is going to crash in a dozen places into the rotating assembly. So I have to spend a couple of hours cutting little bits and pieces off of this thing with my die grinder so that it will swing over completely free and catch the oil. Okay, more on that in a minute. Okay, next is the windage tray. Now, in order to install the windage tray that I'm using, you have to use these Milodon studs on 2 of the main caps, right? You see that? The bolts have been replaced. Normally, I replace all the main caps with studs, but because this is a street engine and the power level is going to be mild, I think I'll probably just leave it as it is. So Milodon studs are meant to work with a Milodon windage tray, which I don't really care for. I agree with Bill on this one, right? The Milodon windage tray is a solid piece of sheet metal with some louvers in it. And I prefer the kind I'm going to use here. Here's what Bill says. If you're going to use a windage tray, use this kind, right? And I like them already myself. Now you can see as I'm moving it around, hopefully with this camera, that you can see right through this. It's called a screen windage tray. And let's lay it on. I've had to do substantial work to this because it's not for an Oldsmobile. There isn't anybody making one of these for an Oldsmobile. This is a Canton windage tray for a big block Chevy. And I've had to cut the tail off it, and I've had to do some deburring, and I've had to do some bending to it. And I've had to elongate the holes. So it looks pretty ugly. And really, that's, you know, that's one of the hallmarks of a purpose-built and hand-built engine, is that sometimes you have to do some handwork, you know, and it looks like handwork. You know, it doesn't look like a CNC cylinder head when you port it by hand, and this is just par for the course. Open up any racing engine and you're going to see hand grinding in it, which this engine will require some, as I'll talk about later. Okay, so that lays on there, and I don't think you'll be able to see, but the clearance with the connecting rods is pretty tight under there, but they do swing freely. I already checked it. Oh, by the way, before I forget to say this in the video, someone wanted me to confirm what Bill says in his book, and that is the crankshaft in the DX diesel has the same main bearing sizes as the big block Oldsmobiles, the 425, the 455. It does. When I had the main caps off to install these studs, I put my vernier on that bearing, and it measured 3 inches, just like a big block. So that is confirmed. Okay. So all I need now are a couple of nuts, right, to lock that down. Also, the reason I had to do substantial work over here, you can see my magic marker, is to clear the Oldsmobile oil pump, which I have right over here on my bench. And let's find out. This is a M22 FHV. This is the high volume that has the bolt-on pickup, and I'll tell you why I needed that in a minute. This is I think a sealed power oil pump, not a milling. Okay, but you could use a milling. I'm sure it would be the same. Okay, so you can see that's sitting flat. I would bolt it down, and the relief spring housing, which sticks out really far on the distinctive Oldsmobile oil pump, you can see is clearing my windage tray here. You don't notice a dipstick in here because I just took out the tube for it, but that also clears this windage tray, no problem. So that can be a real hassle in some engines, so I'm really glad that I was able to pull that off too. Okay, I'm just going to pull this on to show you. I'm going to pull it off to show you the third modification, which is pretty standard. I saved the package, by the way, for the Milodon stud kit, so there's the part number for you. It comes with pretty much everything you need. And when you put the studs in, you just hand tighten them in, and you use some thread locker. Make sure they recommend you bottom tap the block so they go all the way down, because believe me, the clearance is tight. As a matter of fact, I had to cut off the tops. The back ones I didn't have to do it because of the sump, but I had to cut off about a 1/4 inch off the top of these studs. Still enough here for nuts so that I could clear my Moroso oil pan, even though it's an aftermarket 8-quart oil pan. Yeah, clearance can be pretty tight when you start adding things to the bottom end. Okay, so you can see this is a deep sump. It's got a baffle in it. But the main purpose, of course, is to get the oil away from the spinning crank assembly, right? So I'll just lay that on there for you so you can see it. And it's laying just about completely flat. There's just a tiny little bit of rock left when I put those nuts on. And with my gaskets, I'm hoping that will take it away and no leaks. If not, I'll have to cut a little more. But yeah, this is just one of those things in engine building. Now, even though it's an aftermarket pan, It is supposedly meant by Moroso, designed to clear most of this, common chassis. Chances are this is going to end up in some kind of cutlass. So even though you lose ground clearance with it compared to a stock oil pan, you lose at least an inch of ground clearance, maybe an inch and a half. In a cutlass type body, it shouldn't be a problem. It's not going in a Corvette. And they've also provided the depressions in the oil pan for the steering gear clearance. So I feel pretty good about this pan. That's good. Right. Now, if you don't do anything else, an upgraded pan is usually worth it, just to get that oil away from the spinning crank. And that's what all this is about, right? Just talk for a minute about how this is meant to work, this stuff, right? Because what happens with that crankshaft is once it's whipping around at, could up to several thousand RPMs. Tests have been done, and they say that about at even on the street, 4,000 RPMs is about the place where a crankshaft is really going to start picking up what they call windage. That is, it's going to start throwing oil around and act like a crude propeller, and it's going to pick up so much oil that it's actually going to lose, could be quite a good chunk of horsepower. It could be 20, 25 horsepower. And that's just free power if you do these kind of mods that you can take back. So how are we going to take it back, right? Here's the way it's meant to work. The crankshaft in most of these engines spins clockwise. And it doesn't matter that the engine is upside down on my stand here. Clockwise is clockwise, no matter how you put the engine. Right, so this is the way it's spinning. So the way this is meant to work, right, and you can see that the clearance between the rods there and the tray is close. It's no more than 1/4 of an inch. And you can set the height with these studs, actually. That's one good feature, I suppose. That is, if you need, an 1/8 of an inch, either way, you can set it. Okay, so as the crank is spinning over and over again in a clockwise motion, it's always spitting out some oil, right? Internally from the side clearance of the connecting rods, and it's also throwing off oil that dripped down to it from the top end. Now, one of the other things that I've done just quick in this motor is I'm going to use restricted push rods. A lot of you guys have heard that Oldsmobile have oil return issues from the top end, and so a lot of the oil ends up in the rocker boxes because the return holes are not very big. So what I've elected to do is just not put as much oil up there in the first place, which required some good real roller rockers, which I'm getting, and what else? I can't remember. Anyway, I'm not putting as much oil in the first place, but it doesn't really matter because you're going to get some oil returning down through the camshaft tunnel, off the camshaft, and onto the crankshaft. So what are you going to do with it? You want to get it off there as quickly as possible and back into the sump so that it can't entrain and act like, well, if you've ever been swimming, you know how much that water impedes your progress, slows you down. That's what happens with a crank, right? So as it's spinning clockwise, a lot of that oil is going to get thrown off, hopefully into this windage tray, this screen. And this is meant to work. There's no way you can possibly see it with my camera, but this is meant to work only one way. The oil can pass through this way, but it cannot pass through the opposite way, or it has a much harder time passing, so that the crank can't pick up anything from the oil pan itself, and it quickly gets rid of the oil that's coming from this direction. Now, the way that works is, if you've ever played tennis, you hit the ball into the net, it kills the energy of the ball instantly. The ball just falls down where it is. Or if you've played baseball and you had a net backstop, it can't bounce back, right? And so if a catcher misses a baseball, he has to run back to that netting and pick it up, right? So that's what this windage tray, this screen windage tray, does. It kills the energy of the oil being flung off the crank and just allows it to then drip through the holes into the pan harmlessly and drain back into the sump. Right? Now, whatever oil doesn't get caught by this windage tray on any given revolution, hopefully if it's still clinging to the counterweights or the end of the connecting rods, will get caught on this side, right, the pan side of the crank scraper, and will just drip harmlessly again back into the sump. So that's the reason you have it on this side of the block, right? And that you don't have it on this side of the block, because if you had it on this side of the block, or you had a second one, it would catch the oil on the wrong side, and it wouldn't, you know, it tend to just sit there and continue to get caught in the crankshaft. Okay, so that's why we do it this way. Right? Okay, so there are more oil control mods that could be done if I were running a race car. Ultimate, of course, would be dry sump system, but we're not doing that. We're doing a budget street car here, and it's actually a fairly low RPM motor, is what I'm designing it to be. So this is as far as I'm going to go. And some people would say this is overkill for a street motor. You're not going to save that much because you're never going to be up in the RPMs. But I just feel myself as if, especially since I'm going to be dealing with fairly low cubic inches of 350, I want to save every horsepower I can possibly get. And this is really not that expensive to do these kind of modifications. Even with the pan, I didn't pay full price for the pan, even though it is new. I just was patient, looked for a good price on one, and I think everything you're seeing here is about $300. So to me, if I can save, you know, the occasional odd 20 horsepower as I'm getting a little bit loose for $300, to me that's worth the money. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you is the timing chain obstacle that if you do a DX conversion into a gas engine, you're going to run into. I won't bother to flip the block. You can see the timing chain set up right down here. And it looks like what appears to be, if you're familiar with an Oldsmobile block, it looks like you've got two cam tunnels here. But that's not the case. What you got is the garden variety cam tunnel that comes in every gas block. And this is actually the tunnel for the injector pump, I believe it is, that usually sits up in the valley for a diesel engine. Okay. Now the problem here is, well, there are two problems with it. One is there's an oil feed hole that you can't see, but it's tiny, but it connects the cam tunnel into that tunnel to oil that when it spins around. So that needs to be blocked, right? Either by a set screw, which I thought was going to be very difficult to do as I looked at it. And I think, well, for now, I'll put it this way. What I've done is I've driven the bearing, which is like a tiny cam bearing, further in so that the oil feed hole is blocked by it. Okay, and that may be the solution I stick with. So I won't have an internal oil leak, in other words. So you're going to make sure you block that hole somehow or another, right? But the bigger issue, I know it's hard to see here, but that injector pump tunnel is not on plane with the cam tunnel, okay? It's off at an angle, not 45 degrees, but I don't know, something approaching that. And what it does is it interferes with your gasoline upper timing gear, the big timing gear. You can't seat it properly the way you can with a gas block because it'll crash into here. So here are the two of them right here. These are both the upper gears. One's for the gasoline block and one's for the diesel. The diesel timing set was in excellent shape, except for the chain being somewhat stretched, so I bought another one. And what you can see with the diesel is that it's concave or convex, whatever the proper term is. That is, it gets its clearance away from that injector gear, that injector pump, by coming away from the block. And the way that the bottom gear, they handled that was just to simply put a spacer in to get that gear out, to get that chain further away from the block. And you can see that the big oil slinger in a gas block has been replaced by a small one because it sits right up against the seal, the cover seal. So this is the way that they handled that problem. with the diesel is just to simply replace it with a special timing set that will clear. Okay, now here's the problem with sticking to that system, which I may do. I'm considering doing it, and that is, you guys know that the oil pump, the fuel pump eccentric, right, normally rides on the outside of the cam, on the outside of this gear, and that's how you drive your fuel pump. You know, the arm comes in through the side cover. Through the block, and the eccentric pumps up the arm up and down. With this diesel gear, you can't do that because the eccentric does not clear properly the, well, we'll put it this way, this gear does not properly clear that fuel pump arm. And so if you're going to stick with this setup, you're going to end up using an electric fuel pump. And not a huge issue, really. I mean, I've used electric fuel pumps in gasoline, trucks, for example, that normally used a manual fuel pump. Holly's got one that for a carburetor is inexpensive. I think it's like $65. It's internally regulated at something like 6 psi, and so you don't have to buy a separate regulator for it. And that may be the way that I go here. One of the things I'm a little reluctant to do, see, what Travato does is he's got a machine shop at his disposal, and so he puts it in a mill, and he end mills off this entire boss, and it looks nice and neat. It's just gone, so he picks up his clearance for the old traditional timing set. Or I could take my die grinder and spend an hour or so just getting rid of it, right? Just cutting it off. And that would look pretty ugly, but it doesn't matter because no one's ever going to see it. And then I can run my mechanical fuel pump. Or I could just leave it the way it is, and bolt everything up and just run that electric fuel pump. And that may be the direction that I go in. If I start grinding away, I mean, the bottom end here is together. If I start grinding away at that, chips are going to fly everywhere, and who knows what, one little metal chip down in that cam tunnel that escapes me. Even though I mask everything off and put rags in there and everything like that, or one metal chip in the bottom end that ends up in a bearing is not worth it all. So I might just stick with the electric fuel pump setup. Anyway, so there's a quick overview, guys, of some of the obstacles involved when you do modifications to this kind of conversion. I still think at this point that they're well worth doing. And that this block, given the strength of this DX diesel block, you definitely want to go with this if you can, especially if you're using one of the Generation 2 windowed main blocks. This is such a great upgrade. Now, maybe in a future video I'll talk about how I finally ended up handling the oiling situation overall for the block to make sure that I wasn't going to end up with a broken crankshaft, because the bigger your mains, of course, the harder it is, the more the oiling system has a job to do to keep them oiled. But I will say this, there are a few miles on this. It's a low miles good wrench engine, which is why I'm not rebuilding the bottom end. It looks great. You can see the cross hatching very clearly in the cylinders. Anyway, the two main bearings that I looked at when I put the studs in, they looked fantastic. Nothing wrong with them whatsoever. And so I would love to have stuck with a, just a standard volume oil pump. However, they don't come with the bolt-on pickup, right? You have to braze the pickup in like you do with a Chevy. And I really wanted the bolt-on pickup because of the oil pan. I just think a bolt-on pickup is it's easier during assembly, and it's also a lot safer, in the end. Have seen some brazed oil pump pickups cause some problems in my time. So anyway, I'm not going to go in that direction. All right, so I'll give you another update as we move along. This just a teaser. This engine is going to get the aluminum heads. And in the end, we're hoping to make well over 400 foot-pounds of torque with it. right down to the bottom of the rev range in the street with a street roller cam. Okay, guys, thanks for your time.